Chapter 13. Ippolitus, who had languished under a long and dangerous illness, occasioned by his wounds, but heightened and prolonged by the distress of his mind, was detained in a small town on the coast of Calabria, and was yet ignorant of the death of Cornelia. He scarcely doubted that Julia was now devoted to the Duke, and this thought was at times poison to his heart. After his arrival in Calabria, immediately on the recovery of his senses, he dispatched a servant back to the castle of Mazzini to gain secret intelligence of what had passed after his departure. The eagerness with which we endeavor to escape from misery taught him to encourage a remote and romantic hope that Julia yet lived for him. Yet even this hope at length languished into despair, as the time elapsed which should have brought his servant from Sicily. Days and weeks passed away in the utmost anxiety to Ippolitus, for still his emissary did not appear, and at last, concluding that he had been either seized by robbers or discovered and detained by the Marquis, the Count sent off a second emissary to the castle of Mazzini. By him he learned the news of Julia's flight, and his heart dilated with joy. But it was suddenly checked when he heard the Marquis had discovered her retreat in the Abbey of St. Augustine. The wounds which still detained him in confinement now became intolerable. Julia might yet be lost to him forever, but even his present state of fear and uncertainty was bliss compared with the anguish of despair, which his mind had long endured. As soon as he was sufficiently recovered, he quitted Italy for Sicily in the design of visiting the monastery of St. Augustine, where it was possible Julia might yet remain. That he might pass with the secrecy necessary to his plan and escape the attacks of the Marquis, he left his servants in Calabria and embarked alone. It was morning when he landed at a small port of Sicily and proceeded towards the Abbey of St. Augustine. As he traveled, his imagination revolved the scenes of his early love, the distress of Julia, and the sufferings of Ferdinand, and his heart melted at the retrospect. He considered the probabilities of Julia having found protection from her father in the pity of the Padre Abate, and even ventured to indulge himself in a flattering fond anticipation of the moment when Julia should again be restored to his sight. He arrived at the monastery, and his grief may easily be imagined when he was informed of the death of his beloved sister, and of the flight of Julia. He quitted St. Augustine's immediately, without even knowing that Madame de Menin was there, and set out for a town at some leagues' distance, where he designed to pass the night. Absorbed in the melancholy reflections which the late intelligence excited, he gave the reins to his horse, and journeyed on unmindful of his way. The evening was far advanced when he discovered that he had taken a wrong direction, and that he was bewildered in a wild and solitary scene. He had wandered too far from the road to hope to regain it, and he had beside no recollection of the objects left behind him. A choice of errors only lay before him. The view on his right hand exhibited high and savage mountains, covered with heath and black fir, and the wild desolation of their aspect, together with the dangerous appearance of the path that wound up their sides, and which was the only apparent track they afforded, determined Ippolitus not to attempt their ascent. On his left lay a forest, to which the path he was then in led. Its appearance was gloomy, but he preferred it to the mountains, and since he was uncertain of its extent, there was a possibility that he might pass it and reach a village before the night was set in. At the worst, the forest would afford him a shelter from the winds, and, however he might be bewildered in its labyrinths, he could ascend a tree and rest in security till the return of light should afford him an opportunity of extricating himself. Among the mountains there was no possibility of meeting with other shelter than what the habitation of man afforded, and such a shelter there was little probability of finding. Innumerable dangers also threatened him here, from which he would be secure on level ground. Having determined which way to pursue, he pushed his horse into a gallop, and entered the forest as the last rays of the sun trembled on the mountains. The thick foliage of the trees threw a gloom around, which was every moment deepened by the shades of evening. The path was uninterrupted, and the Count continued to follow it till all distinction was confounded in the veil of night. Total darkness now made it impossible for him to pursue his way. He dismounted, and, fastening his horse to a tree, climbed among the branches, purposing to remain there till morning. He had not been long in this situation when a confused sound of voices from a distance roused his attention. The sound returned at intervals for some time, but without seeming to approach. He descended from the tree that he might the better judge of the direction whence it came, but before he reached the ground the noise was ceased, and all was profoundly silent. He continued to listen, but the silence remaining undisturbed, he began to think he had been deceived by the singing of the wind among the leaves, and was preparing to reascend, when he perceived a faint light glimmer through the foliage from afar. The sight revived a hope that he was near some place of human habitation. He therefore unfastened his horse, and led him towards the spot whence the ray issued. The moon was now risen, and threw a checkered gleam over his path sufficient to direct him. Before he had proceeded far, the light disappeared. He continued, however, his way, as nearly as he could guess, towards the place whence it had issued, and, after much toil, found himself in a spot where the trees formed a circle around a kind of rude lawn. The moonlight discovered to him an edifice which appeared to have been formerly a monastery, but which now exhibited a pile of ruins, whose grandeur, heightened by decay, touched the beholder with reverential awe. Hippolytus paused to gaze upon the scene. The sacred stillness of night increased its effect, and a secret dread, he knew not wherefore, stole upon his heart. The silence and the character of the place made him doubt whether this was the spot he had been seeking, and as he stood hesitating whether to proceed or to return, he observed a figure standing under an archway of the ruin. It carried a light in its hand, and, passing silently along, disappeared in a remote part of the building. The courage of Hippolytus for a moment deserted him. An invincible curiosity, however, subdued his terror, and he determined to pursue, if possible, the way the figure had taken. He passed over loose stones through a sort of court, till he came to the archway. Here he stopped, for fear returned upon him. Resuming his courage, however, he went on, still endeavoring to follow the way the figure had passed, and suddenly found himself in an enclosed part of the ruin, whose appearance was more wild and desolate than any he had yet seen. Seized with unconquerable apprehension, he was retiring, when the low voice of a distressed person struck his ear. His heart sunk at the sound, his limbs trembled, and he was utterly unable to move. The sound, which appeared to be the last groan of a dying person, was repeated. Hippolytus made a strong effort and sprang forward, when a light burst upon him from a shattered casement of the building, and at the same instant he heard the voices of men. He advanced softly to the window, and beheld in a small room, which was less decayed than the rest of the edifice, a group of men who, from the savageness of their looks and from their dress, appeared to be banditti. They surrounded a man who lay on the ground wounded, and bathed in blood, and who it was very evident had uttered the groans heard by the Count. The obscurity of the place prevented Hippolytus from distinguishing the features of the dying man. From the blood which covered him, and from the surrounding circumstances, he appeared to be murdered, and the Count had no doubt that the men he beheld were the murderers. The horror of the scene entirely overcame him. He stood rooted to the spot, and saw the assassins rifle the pockets of the dying person, who, in a voice scarcely articulate, but which despair seemed to aid, supplicated for mercy. The ruffians answered him only with execrations, and continued their plunder. His groans and his sufferings served only to aggravate their cruelty. They were proceeding to take from him a miniature picture, which was fastened round his neck and had been hitherto concealed in his bosom, when, by a sudden effort, he half raised himself from the ground and attempted to save it from their hands. The effort availed him nothing. A blow from one of the villains laid the unfortunate man on the floor without motion. The horrid barbarity of the act seized the mind of Ippolitus so entirely that, forgetful of his own situation, he groaned aloud and started with an instantaneous design of avenging the deed. The noise he made alarmed the banditti, who, looking whence it came, discovered the Count through the casement. They instantly quitted their prize and rushed towards the door of the room. He was now returned to a sense of his danger, and endeavoured to escape to the exterior part of the ruin, but terror bewildered his senses, and he mistook his way. Instead of regaining the archway, he perplexed himself with fruitless wanderings, and at length found himself only more deeply involved in the secret recesses of the pile. The steps of his pursuers gained fast upon him, and he continued to perplex himself with vain efforts at escape, till at length, quite exhausted, he sunk on the ground and endeavoured to resign himself to his fate. He listened with a kind of stern despair, and was surprised to find all silent. On looking round, he perceived by a ray of moonlight, which streamed through a part of the ruin from above, that he was in a sort of vault, which, from the small means he had of judging, he thought was extensive. In this situation he remained for a considerable time, ruminating on the means of escape, yet scarcely believing escape was possible. If he continued in the vault, he might continue there only to be butchered, but by attempting to rescue himself from the place he was now in, he must rush into the hands of the banditti. Judging it, therefore, the safer way of the two to remain where he was, he endeavoured to await his fate with fortitude, when suddenly the loud voices of the murderers burst upon his ear, and he heard steps advancing quickly towards the spot where he lay. Despair instantly renewed his vigour. He started from the ground, and throwing around him a look of eager desperation, his eye caught the glimpse of a small door, upon which the moonbeam now fell. He made towards it, and passed it just as the light of a torch gleamed upon the walls of the vault. He groped his way along a winding passage, and at length came to a flight of steps. Notwithstanding the darkness, he reached the bottom in safety. He now, for the first time, stopped to listen. The sounds of pursuit were ceased, and all was silent. Continuing to wander on ineffectual endeavours to escape, his hands at length touched cold iron, and he quickly perceived it belonged to a door. The door, however, was fastened, and resisted all his efforts to open it. He was giving up the attempt in despair, when a loud scream from within, followed by a dead and heavy noise, roused all his attention. Silence ensued. He listened for a considerable time at the door, his imagination filled with images of horror, and expecting to hear the sound repeated. He then sought for a decayed part of the door, through which he might discover what was beyond, but he could find none. And, after waiting some time without hearing any further noise, he was quitting the spot, when, in passing his arm over the door, it struck against something hard. On examination, he perceived, to his extreme surprise, that the key was in the lock. For a moment he hesitated what to do, but curiosity overcame other considerations, and with a trembling hand he turned the key. The door opened into a large and desolate apartment, dimly lighted by a lamp that stood on a table, which was almost the only furniture of the place. The Count had advanced several steps before he perceived an object which fixed all his attention. This was the figure of a young woman lying on the floor, apparently dead. Her face was concealed in a robe, and the long auburn tresses, which fell in beautiful luxuriance over her bosom, served to veil a part of the glowing beauty which the disorder of her dress would have revealed. Pity, surprise, and admiration struggled in the breast of Ippolitus, and while he stood surveying the object which excited these different emotions, he heard a step advancing towards the room. He flew to the door by which he had entered, and was fortunate enough to reach it before the entrance of the persons whose steps he heard. Having turned the key, he stopped at the door to listen to their proceedings. He distinguished the voices of two men, and knew them to be those of the assassins. Presently he heard a piercing shriek, and at the same instant the voices of the ruffians grew loud and violent. One of them exclaimed that the lady was dying, and accused the other of having frightened her to death, swearing with horrid imprecations that she was his, and he would defend her to the last drop of his blood. The dispute grew higher, and neither of the ruffians would give up his claim to the unfortunate object of their altercation. The clashing of swords was soon after heard, together with the violent noise. The screams were repeated, and the oaths and execrations of the disputants redoubled. They seemed to move towards the door, behind which Ippolitus was concealed. Suddenly the door was shook with great force. A deep groan followed, and was instantly succeeded by a noise like that of a person whose whole weight falls at once to the ground. For a moment all was silent. Ippolitus had no doubt that one of the ruffians had destroyed the other, and was soon confirmed in the belief, for the survivor triumphed with brutal exultation over his fallen antagonist. The ruffian hastily quitted the room, and Ippolitus soon after heard the distant voices of several persons in loud dispute. The sounds seemed to come from a chamber over the place where he stood. He also heard a trampling of feet from above, and could even distinguish at intervals the words of the disputants. From these he gathered enough to learn that the affray which had just happened, and the lady who had been the occasion of it, were the subjects of discourse. The voices frequently rose together, and confounded all distinction. At length the tumult began to subside, and Ippolitus could distinguish what was said. The ruffians agreed to give up the lady in question to him who had fought for her, and, leaving him to his prize, they all went out in quest of further prey. The situation of the unfortunate lady excited a mixture of pity and indignation in Ippolitus, which for some time entirely occupied him. He revolved the means of extricating her from so deplorable a situation, and in these thoughts almost forgot his own danger. He now heard her sighs, and while his heart melted to the sounds, the farther door of the apartment was thrown open, and the wretch to whom she had been allotted rushed in. Her screams now redoubled, but they were of no avail with the ruffian, who had seized her in his arms, when the Count, who was unarmed, insensible to every impulse but that of a generous pity, burst into the room, but became fixed like a statue when he beheld his Julia struggling in the grasp of the ruffian. On discovering Ippolitus, she made a sudden spring, and liberated herself, when running to him, she sunk lifeless in his arms. Surprise and fury sparkled in the eyes of the ruffian, and he turned with a savage desperation upon the Count, who, relinquishing Julia, snatched up the sword of the dead ruffian which lay upon the floor, and defended himself. The combat was furious, but Ippolitus laid his antagonist senseless at his feet. He flew to Julia, who now revived, but who for some time could speak only by her tears. The transitions of various and rapid sensations which her heart experienced, and the strangely mingled emotions of joy and terror that agitated Ippolitus, can only be understood by experience. He raised her from the floor, and endeavored to soothe her to composure, when she called wildly upon Ferdinand. At his name the Count started, and he instantly remembered the dying cavalier, whose countenance the glooms had concealed from his view. His heart thrilled with secret agony, yet he resolved to withhold his terrible conjectures from Julia, of whom he learned that Ferdinand, with herself, had been taken by Banditti in the way from the villa which had offered them so hospitable a reception after the shipwreck. They were on the road to a port, whence they designed again to embark for Italy, when this misfortune overtook them. Julia added that Ferdinand had been immediately separated from her, and that for some hours she had been confined in the apartment where Hippolytus found her. The Count with difficulty concealed his terrible apprehensions for Ferdinand, and vainly strove to soften Julia's distress. But there was no time to be lost. They had yet to find a way out of the edifice, and before they could accomplish this, the banditti might return. It was also possible that some of the party were left to watch this, their abode, during the absence of the rest, and this was another circumstance of reasonable alarm. After some little consideration, Hippolytus judged it most prudent to seek an outlet through the passage by which he entered. He therefore took the lamp and led Julia to the door. They entered the avenue, and locking the door after them, sought the flight of steps down which the Count had before passed. But having pursued the windings of the avenue a considerable time without finding them, he became certain he had mistaken the way. They, however, found another flight, which they descended, and entered upon a passage so very narrow and low as not to admit of a person walking upright. This passage was closed by a door, which, on examination, was found to be chiefly of iron. Hippolytus was startled at the sight, but on applying his strength found it gradually yield, when the imprisoned air rushed out and had nearly extinguished the light. They now entered upon a dark abyss, and the door, which moved upon a spring, suddenly closed upon them. On looking round, they beheld a large vault, and it is not easy to imagine their horror on discovering they were in a receptacle for the murdered bodies of the unfortunate people who had fallen into the hands of the banditti. The Count could scarcely support the fainting spirits of Julia. He ran to the door, which he endeavored to open, but the lock was so constructed that it could only be moved on the other side, and all his efforts were useless. He was constrained, therefore, to seek for another door, but could find none. Their situation was the most deplorable that can be imagined, for they were now enclosed in a vault strewn with the dead bodies of the murdered, and must there become the victims of famine or of the sword. The earth was in several places thrown up, and marked the boundaries of new-made graves. The bodies which remained unburied were probably left either from hurry or negligence, and exhibited a spectacle too shocking for humanity. The sufferings of Hippolytus were increased by those of Julia, who was sinking with horror, and who he endeavored to support to a part of the vault which fell into a recess where stood a bench. They had not been long in this situation when they heard a noise which approached gradually, and which did not appear to come from the avenue they had passed. The noise increased, and they could distinguish voices. Hippolytus believed the murderers were returned, that they had traced his retreat, and were coming towards the vault by some way unknown to him. He prepared for the worst, and, drawing his sword, resolved to defend Julia to the last. Their apprehension, however, was soon dissipated by the trampling of horses, which sound had occasioned his alarm, and which now seemed to come from a courtyard above, extremely near the vault. He distinctly heard the voices of the banditti, together with the moans and supplications of some person whom it was evident they were about to plunder. The sound appeared so very near that Hippolytus was both shocked and surprised, and, looking round the vault, he perceived a small grated window placed very high in the wall, which he concluded overlooked the place where the robbers were assembled. He recollected that his light might betray him, and horrible as was the alternative, he was compelled to extinguish it. He now attempted to climb to the grate, through which he might obtain a view of what was passing without. This at length he effected, for the ruggedness of the wall afforded him a footing. He beheld in a ruinous court, which was partially illuminated by the glare of torches, a group of banditti surrounding two persons who were bound on horseback, and who were supplicating for mercy. One of the robbers, exclaiming with an oath that this was a golden night, bade his comrades dispatch, adding he would go to find Paolo and the lady. The effect which the latter part of this sentence had upon the prisoners in the vault may be more easily imagined than described. They were now in total darkness in this mansion of the murdered, without means of escape, and in momentary expectation of sharing a fate similar to that of the wretched objects around them. Julia, overcome with distress and terror, sunk on the ground, and Ippolitus, descending from the grate, became insensible of his own danger in his apprehension for her. In a short time, all without was confusion and uproar. The ruffian who had left the court returned with the alarm that the lady was fled and that Paolo was murdered. The robbers, quitting their booty to go in search of the fugitive and to discover the murderer, dreadful vociferations resounded through every recess of the pile. The tumult had continued a considerable time, which the prisoners had passed in a state of horrible suspense, when they heard the uproar advancing towards the vault, and soon after a number of voices shouted down the avenue. The sound of steps quickened. Ippolitus again drew his sword and placed himself opposite the entrance, where he had not stood long when a violent push was made against the door. It flew open, and a party of men rushed into the vault. Ippolitus kept his position, protesting he would destroy the first who approached. At the sound of his voice they stopped, but presently advancing, commanded him in the king's name to surrender. He now discovered what his agitation had prevented him from observing sooner, that the men before him were not banditti, but the officers of justice. They had received information of this haunt of villainy from the son of a Sicilian nobleman, who had fallen into the hands of the banditti and had afterwards escaped from their power. The officers came attended by a guard, and were every way prepared to prosecute a strenuous search through these horrible recesses. Ippolitus inquired for Ferdinand, and they all quitted the vault in search of him. In the court to which they now ascended, the greater part of the banditti were secured by a number of the guard. The count accused the robbers of having secreted his friend, whom he described, and demanded to have liberated. With one voice they denied the fact, and were resolute in persisting that they knew nothing of the person described. This denial confirmed Ippolitus in his former terrible surmise, that the dying cavalier, whom he had seen, was no other than Ferdinand, and he became furious. He bade the officers prosecute their search, who, leaving a guard over the banditti they had secured, followed him to the room where the late dreadful scene had been acted. The room was dark and empty, but the traces of blood were visible on the floor, and Julia, though ignorant of the particular apprehension of Ippolitus, almost swooned at the sight. On quitting the room, they wandered for some time among the ruins, without discovering anything extraordinary, till, in passing under the archway by which Ippolitus had first entered the building, their footsteps returned a deep sound, which convinced them that the ground beneath was hollow. On close examination, they perceived by the light of their torch a trap-door, which with some difficulty they lifted, and discovered beneath a narrow flight of stairs. They all descended into a low winding passage, where they had not been long when they heard a trampling of horses above, and a loud and sudden uproar. The officers, apprehending that the banditti had overcome the guard, rushed back to the trap-door, which they had scarcely lifted, when they heard a clashing of swords and a confusion of unknown voices. Looking onward, they beheld through the arch, in an inner sort of court, a large party of banditti who were just arrived, rescuing their comrades and contending furiously with the guard. On observing this, several of the officers sprang forward to the assistance of their friends, and the rest, subdued by cowardice, hurried down the steps, letting the trap-door fall after them with a thundering noise. They gave notice to Ippolitus of what was passing above, who hurried Julia along the passage in search of some outlet or place of concealment. They could find neither, and had not long pursued the windings of the way, when they heard the trap-door lifted, and the steps of persons descending. Despair gave strength to Julia, and winged her flight. But they were now stopped by a door which closed the passage, and the sound of distant voices murmured along the walls. The door was fastened by strong iron bolts, which Ippolitus vainly endeavored to draw. The voices drew near. After much labor and difficulty, the bolts yielded, the door unclosed, and light dawned upon them through the mouth of a cave, into which they now entered. On quitting the cave, they found themselves in the forest, and in a short time reached the borders. They now ventured to stop, and looking back, perceived no person in pursuit.